Today we're going to have a look at how to add splashes and splatters from our watercolours onto our page. We're going to consider three key things. There are three things you need to think about before you add the splashes to make sure you get a consistent but also lovely and a little bit random result. And we'll also think about why you possibly going to just chuck a load of paint on your painting at the end and risk ruining it. And there are some really great reasons, and hopefully using some examples you'll get some ideas of how you might evolve this technique for yourself in the future. The first thing to say is that this technique is not without its risks. My walls are covered in paint, and as we practice and practice, gradually the sort of wall splattering effect gets less and less, but it still happens. So there's always a risk with this kind of technique, and that's what makes it so much fun, because along with that risk comes that reward where you might get something absolutely magical happening. If you want to know more about these kind of special watercolour effects, then in my course on sketchflues.co.uk I have a whole workshop dedicated to these kind of splashes, splatters, how to blow the paints around, how to create granulation, all of these effects you can think of, they're all covered in there. So if you want to, check that out, but otherwise, let's get cracking into this video. We're going to dive in now into the techniques of splashing, and we are going to, forgive me, look at the kind of scientific side. And we're going to move through within that three things to think about for your splashes. So, broadly speaking, we'll be applying splashes with our brushes. And the first thing is obviously different brushes, different splashes. And we'll have a go at them each in turn. Let's start off with some red on a small brush. And what's going to happen when I splash? Little splashes. Okay, that makes sense, right? What happens if I take my biggest brush here and I bring in, let's do a different colour so we get a sort of contrast. We'll do a bit of ultramarine blue. Bigger splashes. I mean, it's making sense, isn't it? The bigger brush, the bigger the splash. There are other factors though, of course. So look, this is quite a big brush, but it's a flat brush. So what's going to happen here? Let's use some yellow this time. And if we splash, not very much. What if I turn it around? No, still not very much. So what's the difference here? Well, the difference is the flat brush hairs are not that long, they're tightly packed and they're not whiffling and waffling around. If I flick this at all, the brush fibres just, they want to waft and fling their paint. Even here, the paint fibres are more willing to move and bend and flex than in this flat brush. That doesn't mean I can't get anything out of this brush, but it might mean doing it a different way. So I can, with a lot of water, get a few splashes, but equally doing it like this, suddenly we're using the flexibility of those brush fibres. So doing that with this brush won't do too much because they're too flexible. They don't spring back very far. Because these ones don't want to move, when I do move them, they have this natural spring and they produce this very different splatter. If I try that again, let's use some red so it's a bit more visible. If I just tap, not a lot happens. I do get some if I'm quite vigorous. As soon as I do this, do you see that very fine splatter emerging? So we've got multiple factors to think about here, but the size of the brush, the firmness of the brush fibres, the length of the brush fibres, they're all going to impact, in a sense, the size, the type of splatters. The next thing is the amount of water. Now this is the amount of water in the brush and in the pigment. So if I take this brush and I absolutely load it with water, and I pick up dry pigment, I get splashes like this, incredibly watery. If I take it, but I make it dry, actually first things first, I need to make the pigment really wet, but then I make my brush quite dry. What am I going to get? Smaller, very watery splashes. So the amount of water in the brush changes the size of the splashes. The amount of water in the pigment changes the intensity of the splashes. If we do a like for like and we get some blue, for example, dry off my brush, I'm just drying it on a tissue to the side, and then splash here, that you can see the splashes are the same size as our first blue splashes, but they're almost zero in intensity because the pigment is very wet. Last but certainly not least, and also very obvious, the other thing we need to think about is where are we actually holding our brush? So if we take, let's do something different. We'll get some greens. We've got some green here. And all I'm going to do is use my small brush so it's nice and controlled. And then I come really close, little taps. Look at that. A fine sort of misting of little sort of dots. You can just about see them on the camera just here. There are others going out. But if I come, that was a centimetre, this is an inch. They're bigger and more spread out. If I come 3-4 inches, they are way more spread out. And the same is obviously going to happen with the big brush as well. Let's use some yellow on this. Close, close together. Far, big and far out. And there may even be some on the camera now. And probably on my walls. And I hear you. That doesn't tell me how to do it. But without understanding that, there's no point in me telling you literally how to do it. And how to do it is a matter of trial and error. For me, you've probably just noticed, all I do is I hold my brush like I'm holding, actually I don't know, like holding a chopstick maybe, I'm not sure. But I hold it like this. So I have a nice, easy way to just tap. And I find that the easiest way to quickly produce splatters here, there and everywhere. A lot of people don't find that so easy, but let's take some blue. You can just hold it like so and tap. You can hold it and tap it on something. You can tap it with something. It's not sort of rocket science. It's not complicated. That doesn't make it easy, but it is possible to produce splatters in a lot of ways. All it requires is a movement and a deceleration. So give it a go in a few different ways. You can also experiment beyond. Look, this is my guest toothbrush, the one we give out to all our guests. I am, of course, lying. This is kept in my paints. And if you pop a little bit of gunk on there, look at that. You can just flick. And some people absolutely love using that for textures. I do like it, but it's always a bit of a faff, so I don't do it very often. And you can see again, you can think about what we've been talking about here. These fibres are so rigid that they don't, funny that, nothing happens. But as soon as I flick them, I get this fine misting, a bit like an ultimate flat brush. So there is loads and loads and loads of things to think about. With that, let's have a think about why we might actually want to use these splashes. And I think there are also 3 really good reasons to use splashes. The first is that traditional idea of painting. We're painting something to suggest something or to represent something. Crazy, I know, crazy. But that's often what we're doing. We're actually trying to say, for example with splashes, splatter on some white or yellow paint into a field of green, and now we have daffodils, daisies, sunflowers, whatever flower you want them to be. Maybe even bluebells with a little bit of turquoise or lavender sort of punched on top of a tree scene. And then we also have, beyond just the pure colour, we have the texture. So we might, for example, want to use splashes of blue into the sea to create ripples, or even into the sky to create moody cloud shapes. Now if we flip this on its head, one of my absolute favourite uses for splashes is actually to start off a sky. So instead of applying splashes and leaving them, we apply the splashes, and then those splashes we can join up with a lovely bit of water, and we get that randomness with a little bit of control, but a more flowing and fluid, sort of natural feel to those colours, rather than just coming in and blocking in the sky as all blue. Next, we often want to use our splashes and splatters because they're random, because they're a little bit uncontrolled, and because they kind of imply a spontaneity. And simply by adding a few splashes here and there into our painting, it could liven it up. Something a little bit flat, a little bit mid-toned, which is often what happens when we're sketching quickly. We don't have time to layer up. So it's not a criticism by any means of our art to say it's mid-toned, but we recognise this as sketches, as spontaneous sketches, people creating quick line and wash art. And we go, you know what, we have a cheat, a little cheat code. We splash some paint on, And suddenly we've got little pockets of contrast which really light up the scene. And they just make it fun. And you know what? The reason we're doing it is not that clever. It's because it looks good. And that's fine. This is a very personal thing, as we say in the UK. I don't know if we say this anywhere else, but it's Marmite. You either love it or you hate it. Some people just don't like the splatters, and that's fine as well. But I love them, many people love them, and we just want to put them in because they enhance, in our eyes, our artwork. The other reason, a little bit more scientific, and along these lines, the third and final reason you might want to use splatters is a little bit of sort of colour theory. Now for me, if you have one colour, let's say we've got a bright red postbox, a bright yellow lamp, or even a distant blue lighthouse in a scene, or a red lighthouse in a scene, and that's the only pocket of that colour, we've just got that one bright pocket of that colour, then it looks odd. That thing just goes, zooms in on your eye. If we take our little splashes and splash them somewhere balancing out that scene, just like magic, the eye is no longer overdrawn. Instead, it looks like a lovely little punch of colour and contrast and fun, but it's balanced across the scene. So just these little sensitive splashes can add colour theory, who knew, to our scene. And there you go. 3 things to think about when adding your splashes, about not just the techniques, but how your splashes might turn out. 3 reasons to use them. And if you enjoyed this video, do subscribe, leave me a comment, let me know your tips, your favourite ways of doing things, and you might like one of these videos to watch next. So thank you everyone for watching my little sketching videos. If you enjoy my content, please do subscribe to my channel because it makes me really, really happy. Thanks again.